Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ashley Brown, and on behalf of KLR and our affiliate companies, I wanted to welcome you to our webinar on year-end reporting requirements for COVID-19 relief recipients. As you can see here, I have Jamie and Sandy with me. And if you receive provider relief funding, EIDL grants, and loans or education stabilization funding today will be extremely helpful. Sandy and Jamie will be reviewing not only how to determine if your company has a reporting requirement and what type of federal reporting is required, but also what to look for in a firm to conduct your audit and what you should expect from an auditor and what we should be watching out for in the 2020 Fall Compliance Supplement. Just a reminder, a link to a recording of today's session will be sent via email this afternoon. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sandy and Jamie. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you for the warm introduction, and good morning, everyone. We hope that this session will help clarify some of the questions that we've been getting, and also I think we're all kind of inundated with new information that's coming out, so we're hoping to kind of clarify some of that this morning. So without further ado, I'm going to get started on the presentation. So some of the stuff that we're going to cover today is, first and foremost, how do you determine what your federal reporting requirements are? How do you determine what types of federal reporting requirement you're gonna have to fulfill? As Ashley mentioned, what to look for in a firm, just some specific things that you need to ask for and some due diligence requirements. And then what to expect when working with an auditor on a single audit and program specific audit. I'm going to hand it over to Jamie to discuss federal reporting requirements.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So first and foremost, you want to know when you actually have a federal reporting requirement. So it applies when you have more than $750,000 of federal funds. That can be from either directly from the federal agency or a pass-through, so you'd be a subrecipient. We want to make sure that you have more than $750,000 in federal funds in order to have a single audit or a program-specific audit. We're also going to go into, under the federal reporting requirements, which COVID-19 programs actually require a single audit or program-specific audit, and if you received PPP funding as well, and what you need to do with that. So we're going to go right into the single audit.
Maybe before we move on, I think some folks might not be familiar with pass-through, what a pass-through is and what a subrecipient is. Can you kind of explain that?
Of course. So when an organization receives the federal funding directly, they actually pass it through to maybe your organization. So there'd be another organization involved and would go to them, and you'd be listed as a subrecipient in their contract. So you want to make sure that you're receiving that as a subrecipient. So we're going to get into more detail on documentation when it comes to preparing for your CFA to ensure that you're actually qualified as a subrecipient and not just receiving the funds, which is maybe federal, but you may not necessarily be a subrecipient requiring a single audit. So there are some things you want to make sure you're on the lookout for when it gets to that. We will definitely get into more detail on that when we go to preparing the CFA or the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. So what is a single audit? So a single audit has two main parts. You have the audit of the financial statements, and you also have the audit of the compliance with the terms of the major federal program. So the audit is really two big parts of it. So you have the financial statements as well as the compliance. However, with the program specific audit, it's a little different. If we want to move over to the next slide, Sandy, we're just going to kind of compare the two. So the program specific audit is just the audit of the compliance for the major programs. So that's really the main difference between a single audit and a program, is that the single audit has the audit of the financial statements, where the program specific is only the audit of the major programs. And in order to have a program specific audit, and you can elect to get a single audit, a program specific audit versus a single audit, would be if you expended more than $750,000 all within one federal agency or one program. So a lot of times an organization will receive different funds from many different agencies. So a lot of different CFDA numbers, which we will get into that as well, but a lot of different funding sources. So when you're receiving funds from a number of different funding agencies, a program specific audit will not be allowable. But if you receive it all from one agency or all within one program, and you may elect to get a program specific audit and not the basic, not audit of the financial statements, just the audit of the compliance.
So program specific audits aren't new. They are something that's been around for organizations that may receive money from the National Institute on Health for research and development, or SBIR grants and technology-related research and development grants. They've been around for a very long time. This is actually one of the best options for an organization that has never had an audit before or currently doesn't have an audit requirement. In most cases, a program-specific audit wouldn't make sense for a nonprofit organization, only because if they have this much money in federal funds, they're over their state reporting threshold for an audit. So taking into consideration what the current requirements are and what the requirements are because of federal reporting is a big factor in choosing the type of audit that you're going to be performing. In some cases, the contracts will specify that if you have under 500,000, you need an audit in accordance with governmental auditing standards, which isn't a single audit or a basic audit. It's basically the in-between. And in those cases, we recommend going to a program-specific audit because it's much more cost-effective and it's less time-consuming for your team. So really, a program-specific audit is the audit of the contract. And when Jamie mentioned several agencies, a lot of times we're seeing organizations that have provider relief money, and then they received an economic injury disaster loan. So those two are from separate agencies. But then there are funds that are coming from, like, for example, the state of Rhode Island had a pediatric grant that came through from the Department of Treasury. So that would be an example of a pass-through. So state of Rhode Island has federal funds that they're passing through to a healthcare provider. Or state of Rhode Island has funds that they're passing through to an education organization, a school. And so that would kind of quantify as two separate agencies. So the Department of Treasury and the Department of Health or the Department of Education. So you can ask for a waiver and potentially have a program-specific audit anyway. But in those cases, it requires additional work. So it's really good to get an understanding of what those reporting requirements are, so that if you want to ask for a waiver, we get that in play right now, because it may take some time for these agencies to really respond to the next steps.
Sandy, before you move on, when it comes to the subrecipient, as Sandy had mentioned, has passed through, you do want to make sure that you are listed in the contract as a subrecipient to ensure that that is included on your schedule of expenditures of federal awards. Just because you are receiving pass-through money as federal funding does not automatically mean that there are federal funds on your records. So you just want to make sure that's very clear, that just because it may have been passed through does not necessarily mean that you're considered a subrecipient. So it is important that you are discussing that with the agency that has provided these funds to ensure that you're documenting and reporting properly.
Yeah, one good example is if the state contracted to purchase PPE from you, or the federal government contracted to purchase PPE. That's really an exchange. So you're getting money in exchange for PPE that you're giving to them. So in that case, you're a vendor, not a subrecipient or a subcontractor. So very, very important. The state must, or any organization that's giving you federal funding must identify that there are federal reporting requirements to you. It should be in the terms and conditions. If it's not, clarify. There's no harm in asking for confirmation of that. If you want language to how do I request to ensure that I've asked the right question, our contact information is going to be available. Feel free to send us an email. We're happy to answer questions. I know there's a lot of anxiety around federal reporting, especially if it's new to your organization. So again, we're here to help. So kind of in line with what we're talking about, some of the funds that have been identified as having federal reporting requirements are listed on this slide. The most common ones that we're seeing is the Provider Relief Fund, Education Stabilization Fund, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is also CARES Act money. There's a lot of different ways that they're referring to these. The Department of Treasury has also provided funding. I believe that's under the 21 CFDA number. But again, so if you had multiple funds, so if you had the first two, you would not be able to qualify for a single audit because they're from different agencies. And those first two digits in that catalog of federal domestic assistance number signify the source of the money. I'm hoping that the federal, the Office of Management and Budget will create kind of a waiver option that if it's CARES Act sourced money or COVID money, that we'll be able to account that as kind of like a group of funds where we don't have to do a single audit, that we can do a program specific audit.
Just on the last slide, Sandy, just want to make sure that the PPP funds are not eligible for or do not require a single audit. I just want to make sure we didn't miss that. So I don't know if you want to go back to the last slide just for a quick second.
So these are some additional funds that are associated. So at the bottom of the screen in bold, Paycheck Protection Program money is federally sourced, but it's not subject to the single audit requirements or the federal reporting requirements. But if you do have them, it definitely adds a little bit more complexity, and we'll get into that later on in the webinar. So I guess it's going to come sooner than we thought. So if you have PPP funding, the biggest issue is making sure that you have appropriate documentation on what funds you used in order to pay expenditures. So for example, if you have PPP money and then you have provider relief money, they both reimburse for salaries. So what I've been recommending is that folks create kind of a spreadsheet that shows, or some type of report that shows the salaries and what source of funding paid for those salaries. So if my salary is $50,000 and $50,000 of that was reimbursed by PPP, I can't use any more of that salary in provider relief. Another example is, so provider relief allows for a $190,000 cap on salary. So if my salary is 150, PPP will only cover 100 of it. I can use the remaining 50 to cover provider relief. So it's really thinking through the process and simplifying it as much as possible. If you know that you have a pool of people that are over that $100,000 mark and you want to put them in provider relief, do that. If you have certain period of time, so if you can use all of the PPP money in that 8 weeks and you don't want to use any other expenditures, do that. Do what's the most simple so that when you're going through the application phase, it's as easy as possible. You want to make it as justifiable as quickly as possible so that you can get turnaround on the decision of forgiveness, but also so that there provides less complexity when you're looking to support those provider relief funds or any other funds for that matter.
So Sandy, if you're receiving as a salary, you're saying, let's say you have $150,000 in an employee salary, and you receive other federal agency funding for another program, ultimately we cannot use those funds that have already been claimed by the PPP loan for that to cover those expenditures. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. Is that correct?
Correct. We want to make sure the same dollar is not being used, the same dollar spent is not being used to cover multiple expenditures. That's why it's really important to kind of, for me, I'm a very visual person, so I think of a spreadsheet, and I think, you know, going on down one side, I have each employee, and going across the top, I have which source of funds. So if, again, in my example, if I use 25,000 of my salary to cover under PPP and the remaining 25 under another federal contract, then I know that I didn't put that $50,000 in multiple buckets and try and get 50,000 from provider relief and 50,000 from PPP. That's where there's going to be a lot of complexity in the federal reporting and testing this, is making sure that there isn't multiple sources paying for the same expenditure.
Right, so that spreadsheet would actually be really great for when you're preparing your schedule of expenditures of federal awards as backup documentation for how your expenses came about with each of them, how you use them. So that'd be really good for preparing them later.
Again, we have plenty of examples that we can provide in that to support that. So again, double dipping is not permitted, and that double dipping is not necessarily using a chip in the dip bowl, but making sure that we're not using that same dollar to cover multiple expenditures. So Jamie's going to cover how to select an audit firm and what to look for.
So when you want to look for an audit firm, you want to make sure you do your due diligence. Understand that what the audit firm has to offer, make sure they understand the audit of compliance. So you want to make sure that you're looking for an audit firm that can really understand your industry and really be available to help you throughout the year. Make sure that anything that pops up that you understand, and that the audit firm that you are looking for is able to help you throughout the way. You also want to make sure that they are eligible and able to do single audit engagements or program specific. So you want to make sure that you're finding out their reputation, getting a copy of their peer review report, going through their peer review report, making sure that they're following their legal standards and regulations. So that's all coming into a big package of your research. So when you're looking for an organization, you really want someone that you're partnering with and that you can trust knows their knowledge in the area that your organization is really falling in and in that industry. I mean, that's where I would go. And I think a lot more is going to come about when we're going through how to prepare. And you want to make sure that they understand that and have someone that's available to help you prepare all this, because obviously this is new for a lot of organizations. So someone that has the expertise in single audit engagements and really has the peer review to back that up as well is really important to look for.
Jamie, what are some questions that someone can ask the audit firm to kind of get clarity on? Do they have experience in this area?
So a lot of times you ask about the number of maybe single audits that they are working on, the engagements that way. Obviously, you always ask for a copy of their peer review because it will show. The peer review should be a part of an engagement letter when you're engaging with an organization as well, to show that they're really staying in compliance with the regular legal responsibilities and standards and regulations. So you really be asking for that. Ask if they're dealing with what kind of agencies they deal with. Maybe the audit firm you're looking at only works with the Department of Education and has no knowledge in the Department of Labor. And if maybe you're receiving funds that way, or maybe they don't have expertise in a certain agency, it's really important to really ask these questions. Is there any way you can assist me with this agency? Do you have any background, any help with these kind of contracts? Things like that. You really want to ask and discuss these questions to make sure they're knowledgeable in these areas. So that way, when you're receiving a contract, they can help you through it if necessary. I think those are really important questions you should ask.
I know internally our process is we have, in order to perform these audits, we have to have a certain minimum amount of training, and we have a dedicated group of folks that just do this type of work. So we know that we have to annually make sure that we've met that requirement. So kind of asking what their process is and that type of thing is also extremely helpful in understanding what their ability is to really help you through this process. So what to expect? I think this is the question that we get most often. How do I prepare? I've never been through an audit. And again, you want to find a firm that's going to be collaborative with you, understand your situation. You may have an amazing system of internal control, but just that unfamiliarity with the process it creates some anxiety. So we want to make sure that we're kind of alleviating some of that. We want to you want to make sure there's a good personality fit with the person you're going to be working with. And, we're going to walk through a couple different things. So the most important thing, and I think especially with the provider relief money, is really to have almost like a due diligence file. I know we've covered this in our PPP seminars, is having everything that was used to support what you applied for. So if you were applying based on lost profits, have what you used. Was it a prior comparison to the prior year of your lost revenues? Was it expenditures for PPE? Was it all of those things need to be kind of in that one location so that you have a file ready to support what the process was. Have a copy of the grant application. I know in a lot of cases this process was done in such a fast pace just to get the funding because it was running out quickly. So it was all online. Think about what you use to fill out that application and gather that information, because a lot of times you don't have an ability to print out that application because it was multiple screens that you toggled through. So get together that information. Have the support for the amount that you received. I know there were, in the application phase, they said there were multiple sources of documents that you could use. A lot of times they just calculated it based on your Medicare funding or your Medicaid funding. So have that information that they may have used to support the amount. Make sure that you review the contract, and if they reference terms and conditions, understand those, have those available. It really gives, when I go to a client and I see that they have all of this information in a file, it gives me some comfort that, one, they understand that they need to have it, and two, that they've taken the time to really understand what those things are. And then sorry, Jamie.
Sandy, I'd love to just add that that's a perfect example too, is that if you have a contact, email them, contact them, put it in writing. There's a number of times that maybe a CFDA number or is not available, and you call them on the phone, you're not getting really the answer you want. But if you put in an email, you can confirm things yourself as well. You don't need to wait for the audit firm to do confirmations. So a lot of times, a lot of clients that Sandy and I work on, we have a confirmation template to give to our clients to say, here, when we're doing the application, what is all the requirements we're going to have? What is the CFDA number? What is this information? Because we're going to have to complete our schedule of expenditures of federal awards, and we need this data to ensure that we're giving a complete report as well. So it's very important that when you're doing this package and making sure that you're retaining all this documentation, that even if you're writing emails, print your email and include that in there as well. So that way everything is together, an easy package.
And it doesn't need to be paper. I know there's a lot of folks that are, really concerned about being green.
Yep.
It can be a cloud folder. It can be whatever it is, but make sure that it's not like, one thing that's very important is that you make sure that it's not a live document so that it can't be manipulated. So an Adobe, and sometimes those can be manipulated too, but make sure that it's something that shows that it's, third-party verification, or that there's a timestamp, and that, this hasn't been modified since the application date, or this has been modified, but we've adjusted our actual expenditures. So keep in mind, you want to have that folder ready to go, and then understanding what the internal control requirements are for that grant. So do you have to maintain those funds in a interest-bearing account? What have you done to segregate those funds? How are you aware of the period that those funds are available? There's a lot of funding out there that needs to be spent by December 30th. What are we doing to make sure that those funds are being expended appropriately and before that period of time? Are we looking at cutoff? Are we asking our vendors to get us an invoice immediately so that we can apply that? And then there are some funds that go beyond December. For example, the provider relief funds go through 2021. So just because you received $1 million in 2020 doesn't mean that we expect all of that $1 million to be expended by the end of the year. That can run over into the next year. So if you've been able to support 500,000 of that $1 million, then that 500,000 is what shows up on your schedule of federal expenditures. And that schedule is what we use to test. And that's what we use to report to the federal government. So having that amount, understanding, okay, I only spent 500, so I don't have an audit requirement. Understand that 500,000 may have other reporting requirements. So I have to report to the federal agency, and I have to give them a copy of my review, or I have to give them a copy of my audit, or I only have to give them a report that shows my expenditures. Provider Relief actually came out with some additional guidance on November 2nd that specified specific requirements from $10,000 awards to $499,999, and then more detailed requirements for anyone receiving above $500,000. And they actually went into detail as far as what's the documentation that you can use to support the lost profits calculation, which is something we've been waiting for a long time. And I know that there are requirements that are coming out from each of the agencies now because there was a lot of basically vague language that didn't really give us an indication of this is what we can use. This is what you can, this is the information that you need to have ready for reporting. So a lot of that information is available. And we're going to be putting out, as Ashley mentioned, we're going to follow up with some specifics on what's required and to support all of these things. And if we have some time at the end, we'll go over some specifics on these grants as well.
Great. And just to add on to Sandy's internal controls, as part of an audit, which we're preparing for here, is that as part of the process, we actually have to walk through those internal controls with you. So you want to make sure you're documenting them as well. So it's not just we have these controls in place. You want to make sure they're documented, because we're going to request the documented procedures and policies that you have in place. And then we're going to walk through them and see how it's running and how you're really tracking everything. So that is important that you are putting that in writing as well. And then we also want to make sure that you're tracking, how are you tracking these expenditures and keeping your supporting documentation together? As Sandy had already alluded to, maybe an electronic file, cloud file, hard paper copy file. But you want to make sure that you're really putting all the expenditures together. So I know I sit on a board, and a lot of times that we've discussed how we handle all the program income and where it goes through the process. So you want to make sure you're taking that, you take the program expenditures, and you're making sure you're being properly prepared by, and you sign that off, and then you send it over to who's approving it, who's approved these expenditures for this program. You want to make sure that's signed off. And it just shows the whole process and how it's getting there. You also want to make sure, because of that, it's going to determine if it's an allowable expense. Sandy was going over all the ways of testing for the expenses. maybe it's cut off and things like that, but it's also, is it even an allowable expense for that program? Just because we have other expenses doesn't mean it's going to be covered by that revenue that came in from that federal agency. So is it allowable expense is important as well. So you're going to have that all documented and all in there as in that file. You also, as we mentioned, you want to contact the federal agency if you have any more clarification or any questions relating to COVID-19 funding. Is this specific to COVID-19 funding? Am I getting this? Or is this just an increase in our funding this year because of COVID? They're a little bit of a different impact. Just because you received more funds does not mean necessarily it's officially COVID-19 funding. It could just be that this year you received a little additional funding in the program that you already had established in years past. But if it is additional COVID funding, which we'll get into, it needs to be identified separately on your schedule of expenditures. And then lastly, we want to document and identify all these sources on your schedule of expenditures of federal awards. I know I keep saying CFA, but that's really what it references, is the schedule of expenditures. So that is something that we ask for upfront. We need a copy of your schedule of expenditures. It really determines the areas we have to look at. If you have some items that are maybe below, maybe not hitting a threshold, maybe you're above the $750,000 threshold, doesn't mean we have to test. Maybe one agency only gave you $20,000. That program may not necessarily be tested by us, but we would have to test the material ones, or depending on if this is something that you've had in the past, makes you high risk, low risk, but that's a whole nother category of testing. But ultimately, it just comes down to, you want to make sure you're documenting all the different federal agencies, the amounts that's received from each federal agency. And you want to document the catalog of federal domestic assistance, so the CFDA number. So I know we discussed that earlier, and sometimes you're just not provided that immediately. So this is where contacting, finding someone at the agency, emailing them, call them to try to get that number. This is also something that we discussed on subrecipients. You should be receiving that as well. If you're an identified subrecipient in the contract, you should be receiving a copy of that CFDA number. So it does get confusing because sometimes the individual you might be working with may just provide theirs. That doesn't mean that you're a subrecipient. So it depends on your contract. So you want to make sure that you're really asking those questions. And then lastly, we want to make sure that all the documentation is available to show the CFA and the allocation of payroll, and making sure that there's any excess payroll, you want to make sure that's not being claimed. As Sandy had mentioned, that you have that spreadsheet. If you're really tracking all the payroll and what's allocated to each funding source, it'll be a lot easier to show that I did not claim that excess payroll, because here is my spreadsheet to show where it went, and here is the expenses that went to this program and this program. So as Sandy said, the provider relief, I spent 100,000 there, so my salary was 150, so the other 50,000 went under a different program. So you just want to make sure you're really tracking that with that spreadsheet and all the associated benefits that go along with it. Not just necessarily salaries.
So one of the things my board is doing, because we received some PPP money and we received some state money, is we've made a separate class in QuickBooks. And I know not everybody has QuickBooks. They have different types of softwares, but you can create a separate fund or a segregated department code, or just create some simplicity in your system that allows you to get a really good picture, like, have I spent all my PPP money? So just think about different ways that you can do this, maybe a spreadsheet. I know there are folks out there that really don't want to do a separate spreadsheet. Think about internally what you can do in your current system that helps you determine, okay, I didn't double dip. These expenses go into this class, this expense goes into that class. And so at the end of the day, I know for sure, and I can confirm internally as well as externally, that I haven't used those same funds in different buckets. And the reason we're really like honing in on this is because this is a really big issue that is going to be looked at during your audit. And even if you don't need an audit, the agency may come in and ask you for that documentation, especially with the PPP funding and having multiple sources of funding, federal revenue or even state revenue. You want to make sure that you have everything. You want to make sure you have all your ducks in a row, and you want to be prepared. And that's the easiest way to do it. So all of this, we want to make sure that we understand what our deadlines are. So if you have a December 31st deadline, because that's the period we're really looking at, the first bullet on this slide shows there was a 6-month extension. So if I had a June 30, 2019 client that had a single audit requirement, they have 9 months. So in essence, their deadline would be September 30, I'm sorry, March 31st. You know what? Let me talk about what's still active. So December 31st, 2020. So if my calendar year end is December 31st, 2020, I received provider relief money. I have to provide reporting to the federal government by September 30th, 2021. And right now there's no extension on that. If I had reporting, there was some initial extensions provided through 2019. Those have been taken away. So just keep in mind, you have 9 months from your federal year end, from your calendar or fiscal year end to do this federal reporting. At this point, there are no extensions for any fiscal year that hasn't ended yet. So 9 months is a long time. So thinking about that, you have some time, but again, you want to make sure that you have contracted with an audit organization. You want to make sure you get on that schedule. You want to make sure that you're prepared. If you have an audit or a report, so 9 months is kind of like the most time that you can get, but typically it's 30 days from when you get that report. So if I got my audit or my single audit, my program specific audit, and I finished it in June, I technically should submit that before the end of July. So again, if you are working with an audit firm that is aware of these deadlines, they're going to be fully aware of all of these deadlines and will work with you to make sure that everything is in compliance. And if you miss the deadline, it just kind of creates a reporting finding. Jamie, was that what you were going to mention?
No, I was going to say, actually, before you went to that, is that this is not required for a program specific for a for-profit entity. They do not require the submission through the clearinghouse. So this is something that is for the single audit, but I just want to make sure we're clear that this would not apply for a for-profit entity with this program specific audit.
So they do have a reporting requirement, it's just not electronic. They have to
Yes.
submit an electronic copy directly to the agency.
Yep.
So that's thank you, Jamie, for bringing that up. So this is a clearer table as far as what's applicable to these deadlines. And as you can see, anyone with a December year-end requirement would be due December 31st with the extended. But as you can see, September, there's an error there. There's a slight error. There is no 31st day of September there. But just here's a good table to kind of give you a sense of like, when is my report due? So I have read several contracts that state that if you have other federal sources, use those first before you receive our funding. You use our funding. So for example, if you receive PPP money and provider relief, they're going to want you to exhaust the PPP money before you use the provider relief money. Or same thing with any other grant. You want to make sure that there isn't a contingency in there or a requirement to exhaust other funding sources prior to use of the existing contract that you got. So again, when we look at documentation to support that was implemented, we're going to look at timing of those expenditures. So if you received funding and you applied it to, let's say, provider relief, when you could have applied it to a different funding source like PPP, you want to make sure that you're looking at that timing. First, make sure that this is or is not a requirement, and then look at, were these expenses within this period? Did I exhaust all of that other money first before I use this new money?
And then just to add into that, with there's a cash management option thing that you also want to make sure that you're a requirement that you're also making sure you're in compliance with. So if you are using the funds that you receive for another funding agency, and let's say you received the funding from the provider relief already, you just want to make sure that there is something that is in your contract that says that if you're holding funds in advance before the expenditure has actually been incurred, that's being tracked. And it's allowable to be, it's usually in a separate account potentially, maybe is it earning interest, you might have to track that. So you just want to make sure if you're receiving funds and they haven't been spent yet, and it's not more of a reimbursement, but an advancement of funds, that you really understand how you're really recording those and tracking that in revenue as well.
So to kind of walk through that example, so I received $2.5 million of provider relief money. I haven't expended it all yet. I'm using certain criteria. So say I can only support $500,000 of lost profit. I recognize that $500,000. I'm leaving the other money in this other bucket or other account to ensure that I know how much is left in that account. Jamie, is this?
Yep, great. So when it comes to the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, when you do receive the COVID funding specific to COVID, it needs to be identified separately from the other funding sources that you received. So typically you would have the provider relief and you might have to write COVID at the end of it. So that way, ultimately it's showing that that fund was coming from your COVID funding, and it wasn't just an increase in the funding that you received from a federal agency.
So we're going to walk through an example. So this is an example of a pass-through. So you can see this was received from the state of Rhode Island. And the organization, so you can see in the middle of this, the start date is March 1st. So in order for the person, the organization to use this fund, the expense had to be incurred after March 1st. And you can see the sub-award end date of December 30th. So you can see here, this is kind of a typical presentation of a subrecipient grant. And you can see they've identified the source of funding. And, you know, there are a couple of other things that happen within the federal government. If you have an indirect rate, it would show up in this area. If it's research and development, so for example, if you're developing a vaccine, it may show up that this has a component that says yes, which has different audit resulting procedures for the auditor and different compliance requirements for the organization. So understanding this is an example to kind of look at when on the funding that you received. So
Sadie, before you pass along, or this page is fine too. So if you notice, because of the dates, ultimately, if you're a junior end, this would be going over into your 2 fiscal years. So you want to make sure that that 537 that is noted on the amount obligated, it does not mean that's all what would be included on your schedule of expenditures of federal awards. As we had discussed earlier, it would not be included just based on your award amount. It's based on what was expended within your fiscal period.
So again, looking at all of these different components in here, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding if this is a part of the single audit. So does this assistance indicate a single audit requirement? On the surface, no. So that's why we have to really dig in to what we have to look for. So you can see the CFDA number. Oh, sorry. So you're going to look at the CFDA number, and that's actually the 21.019. And there's a nice resource provided by the Government Audit Quality Center that summarizes what the requirements are for each of the CFDA numbers. And we can provide a link to that. So you can see in this table, it gives you guidance as to what are the sources provided by the agency, what is an example of these programs, and it goes through and lists all of these things. And this column in the center that says, does assistance listing indicate single audit requirement? It will say not applicable or yes. So we'll look for that 21019. And we can see here that's Coronavirus Relief Fund. It's from the Department of Treasury. And yes, it does have a requirement for a single audit. So now we have to go one step further and say, okay, have we met other requirements to German? So the total amount of this contract is $537,000. And if we had multiple modifications, so say we got $537,000 and then we got an additional amount, there would be a difference in this total amount obligated versus the amount obligated with this action. So each modification would have a different amount that would add. But in this case, there is the total obligated amount and the total amount to the subrecipient is the same. So we don't need to look for additional contracts and all of that. But if we had multiple, we would want to keep that all in the same file related to this grant. And you can see in this green, the total federal award amount, that is applicable to the organization that gave you funding. So you can see you did not get $1.25 billion. I would love for you to have $1.25 billion. But you're only responsible for accounting for the $537,000. So it, again, as I mentioned earlier, if there was multiple modifications, these two differences would, there would be a difference in these two amounts, and you want to account for all of those differences to get to that total obligated amount. So again, this amount is related to the grantor, not the client, not the organization that received the funding. So you just want to make sure that you don't use the wrong amount for your schedule of federal expenditures. So again, making sure that the expenditures are within this period, and making sure that you have, if you do have, if you've received any type of documentation or waiver or correspondence that said you could use expenditures prior to March 1st, retain that. Because if you use an expenditure prior to the contract date, it will automatically get flagged because it's not within the contract period. But if you have that documentation that says you are allowed to use expenditures from January 2020 through December 31st, then that will make the expense allowable. Otherwise, it will be considered a question cost or unallowable. So just making sure that you have all of that documentation in place and segregated so that you have your proper support for everything that you used. And
Sandy,
again,
I have a question.
Sure.
Let's say that you're an organization that received the advancement of funds and haven't spent all of the funding yet, and you're right now on the borderline of the 750. And the question would be, would you be recording the amount that you received or the amount that you actually expended? So ultimately you have an advancement in your account at this moment. So you haven't spent all the funds. How would that be tracked?
So if you have an advance, so let's use this example actually. So if you had mentioned a June 30 year end. So at June 30th, if I only spent 250,000 of this 530,000, I would only record the 250,000 in my schedule of federal expenditures. I'm going to continue to track the remaining so that in 2021, my next fiscal year, that amount would be included on the schedule of federal expenditures, that remaining balance. So in this example, if I got to December 30th, I'm a calendar year end and I haven't spent the full amount, I'm going to go to the agency, or my recommendation is I'm going to go to the agency and say, I've only spent 400,000. In January, I am expecting my PPP to come in and I'm going to need another 100,000. I can use the remaining balance in January. And the agency says, great, you have a no cost extension through January 31st. Retain that documentation because you want to make sure that you can use that balance in January and not have to pay the organization back. Now, I say that because I have a very positive outlook and I think that the agency is going to approve that because they understand that these organizations are having distribution issues, getting things in the door, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. But I recommend you ask, especially because it hurts to have to pay that money back. And I guarantee you the state probably doesn't want to take it back or the organization doesn't want to take it back. But so have these questions, ask these questions. First and foremost, look at the timeline through December 30th in this specific contract to see if you will be able to expend those amounts. And then plan by asking for an extension, by potentially accelerating some expenditures coming in the door or whatever it is. But make sure that you're really looking at the timeline and making sure that you can utilize these funds. And if not, plan for either paying it back or asking for a no cost extension. So again, the three areas that, the couple of areas that we want you to pay really close attention to would be the subaward start date, the amount obligated on these contracts, and then that CFDA number. You can ignore the blue, ignore that total federal award amount. It really doesn't apply to you. In a lot of cases, this information won't be on the contract, but in this example, it's there. So we want to make sure that you're prepared and understand all of that. So in this example, if our federal contract was only 537,000, that was all we got, there is no single audit requirement. But you want to make sure that you're aware of any other reporting requirements that may come into play. And I know there was under the Health and Human Services for the provider relief money, there are some thresholds of reporting that start at $10,000. So you want to understand where you're at and where, if each agency has separate reporting requirements, separate and apart from the Office of Management and Budget, the federal government. So those are the things that we really want you to be aware of. And I think we may have some questions, but here's our contact information. Again, we're here for you. We understand that there's a lot of anxiety around reporting and understanding what your requirements are. So, we want to be here to help you through this process and help you be prepared. So one of the questions that we got was, as far as provider relief, what are the specific audit requirements? And I have a copy of the new regs that were issued on November 2nd, and I apologize for the paper noise in the background. But they have listed the specific requirements and what you can use for lost profits documentation, which was something I've been waiting for a long time. So I'm sure that you are all really wanting to hear some of this stuff. So what they're saying for lost profits is you can use your method of accounting. So there are multiple methods of accounting, but the two most common and most accepted are cash and accrual basis. So if you run on a cash basis to support your lost profits, use that. So what they want they want actual expenditure, or actual revenue. So if I'm using lost profits as my calculation, I'm going to use 2019 and I'm going to compare it to 2020. And they're not going to allow you to use more than what you incurred in the previous year. So if my budget for 2020 was $5 million, but my actual revenue was only $4 million in that same period, I can only get up to that $4 million. So just keeping that in mind, you're going to go based on actual results. And in addition to your financial reports with the dollar amounts, they're going to want to see non-financial data. So patients, visits, x-rays, whatever it is for that specific organization. So understanding those different things. And the expenditures, a lot of them are specific to COVID-19 expenditures. So how do you determine what's COVID-19 or what is in relation to COVID-19? Again, looking at actual versus current year versus prior year. So you had to buy more PPE this year. You had to increase cleaning costs, all of those different things. And one thing to note, if you do have an audit requirement, that's an allowable expense. So include that in your expenditures and your budgets when you're planning out what the costs are. So it's really important that you get a sense of, okay, I'm going to need an audit requirement. I'm going to ask these firms to give me an estimated cost so that I can include that in my budget and include that in my expenditures to support my provider relief money or education stabilization money. So again, there's a lot in this this new document that came out. So it's if you're on the HHS website, it's financial and reporting requirements. I believe it has audit in the title as well. And we can send out a link to that in our follow-up blog with the frequently asked questions from this session. So there's so much more to cover on this provider relief fund. So I think rather than going in and starting and creating more questions, I think we're gonna stop here. And I want to thank you all for attending our session. Again, I want to let you know that we're available to answer any questions, and we're going to follow up and send out this PowerPoint and also that follow-up questions and blogs from this session that we didn't get a chance to answer. But we want to wish you all a wonderful rest of 2020. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay sane.
Thank you, Jamie and Sandy. We hope that everyone found today helpful and informative. And any questions, as Sandy mentioned, that we weren't able to get to via chat, we will try and cover in follow-up blogs, so keep an eye out for those. Also, we'll be hosting a webinar later this month on tax planning strategies to consider after the election. So stay tuned for more details. And we will be sending out a link to a copy of the PowerPoint and a recording of this webinar this afternoon. And as always, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We're here to help. Thanks again for joining us, and hope everyone has a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.